Hi, I'm Matthew G. Mosman, and this is my presentation about avoidant personality disorder. I tried to avoid making this joke, but I couldn't, so here we are. Uh, I chose to do avoidant personality disorder because, over the years I've worked with a fair number of folk who, at the very least, had avoidant traits, uh, for whom there was a question of avoidant personality disorder. And I know, one of the biggest challenges as a treater can be, working with somebody who's avoidant. It's certainly something that's been frustrating for me, but it's also something I find interesting. I wanted to learn more about it. So, looking into it, I feel like I did learn a lot, and I hope you will too. So here we go. Okay, so here we are. I figure if we're going to start somewhere, we should probably start at the beginning with the etiology. Like, how does this start? How do people become avoidant? How do they start avoiding? We'll get to the DSM criteria in the next slide. But I feel like it's helpful to start here. The DSM says, it might begin with childhood shyness, fear of strangers, that kind of thing. But of course, shyness is very common in children. That's certainly not a basis. It's not something that we're ever going to be diagnosing in children. And even adolescents and young adults, shyness is something that can start in childhood. It's something that can come on during adolescence, even young adulthood, just because of all the transitions that are happening. So we should be, very, very careful about identifying this in young people in general. Because a lot of people will develop shyness, either they'll be shy children, shy adolescents, shy young adults, and that will just kind of burn off as they mature and kind of move out into the world. But for some people, obviously, that shyness doesn't go away. Instead, it intensifies as they move into adulthood, and can become debilitating. Prevents them from working, forming relationships, keeping relationships. That's where we really start looking at, something that we might diagnose as avoidant personality disorder, when that shyness, persists into adulthood and, causes significant problems with functioning. Another thing I've included here from the textbook and from other sources is that it has a high comorbidity with schizophrenia, spectrum disorders, schizophrenia, and schizoaffective spectrum disorders, and it is more common in individuals with a schizophrenic relative. And I'm going to talk about that a bit because that's most of my experience with this, is working with people on the schizophrenia, schizoaffective spectrum. And one of the things I think that a lot of the references in the text and the DSM kind of miss is how that development might be a little bit different in individuals on the schizophrenia spectrum. Because as this is kind of a later onset illness, late adolescence, early adulthood, um, you might not see that shyness in those individuals in, early childhood, but as the comorbid psychotic disorder starts to manifest, it can be an impetus for the development of an avoidant personality as well. And so, schizoaffective spectrum and schizophrenia illness kind of can very much go hand in hand with the development of avoidant personality disorder, for a lot of reasons that I'll continue to go into in the next slide. And here we go. Okay, so here we are with our DSM-5 criteria. These are mostly verbatim. Some of them I've abbreviated a little bit just to get everything to fit without having to go into another slide. But let's just kind of go through these, right? So avoidant personality disorder, number one, avoids occupational activities that involve significant interpersonal contact because of fears of criticism, disapproval, or rejection. Um, Kind of wonder why they say occupational activities. Like, you know, feel like, recreational activities. I've had people who don't want to volunteer. Whatever. I guess it's a little bit of semantics. Unwilling to get involved with people unless certain of being liked. Oh, yeah. Um, Shows restraint with intimate relationships because of fear of being shamed or ridiculed. Oh, yeah. Um, Preoccupied with being criticized or rejected. Inhibited in new interpersonal situations because of feelings of inadequacy. Views self as socially inept, personally unappealing, or inferior to others. Is unusually reluctant to take personal risks or engage in any new activities because they may prove embarrassing. Um, these are things that I've definitely seen. Um, One thing that I would add, going back to, you know, talking about some deficiencies that I see in these, particularly when it comes to individuals who are, avoidant comorbid with schizophrenia, um, is I would kind of add like being challenged to a lot of these. Um, like, for example, shows restraint with intimate or other kinds of relationships because of fear of being shamed or ridiculed or challenged. Um, Same thing with new activities. Um, because what I've seen is that, particularly with individuals that have like a comorbid psychotic disorder, that avoidant personality disorder in them, or at least avoidant traits, emerge out of, these individuals, they develop, strongly held delusional beliefs or tendencies, um, and they start to avoid situations where those beliefs will be challenged. Um, like I worked with a guy who believed that he was like a great martial artist, probably for over 2 years. And I tried by hook or by crook because the guy really wasn't doing anything. And my job was to, get structure in his life, to drag him to a dojo or, anywhere where he could practice his craft. And he wouldn't go. He would never go. And, eventually it became apparent it was because, he had these really kind of almost grandiose beliefs, not almost, they were grandiose, um, about, his abilities. And he was terrified of, yeah, I guess being embarrassed, but just anywhere where he could be challenged. And same, I worked with a guy who believed that he was like this amazing coder. And we tried to get him out of the house to go to like a coding class or a seminar or apply for a job. And you could not get this guy to go anywhere near, um, anywhere where those ideas would be challenged by somebody who had the authority and the knowledge to know that his claims were not true. And in some of these individuals, it seems like it's a specific situation, but over time, it becomes an avoidance of any situation where they may be challenged and therefore embarrassed or humiliated for their delusional beliefs, to the point where they really won't go anywhere, that they're not 100% sure that they will be humored, and that nobody will challenge them. And that's what I've seen with a number of individuals. It starts with avoiding specific situations, and then over time it expands to almost all situations until they become almost totally reclusive. And that's kind of what the pattern of like avoidant behavior that I've seen in psychotic individuals looks like. And I'm sure it looks a little bit different when that's not on board. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's also the case with, other people who meet the avoidant personality criteria. That, it's not that one day they're terrified of the whole world. It's that, it starts with, I don't want to do this one thing because I'm going to be humiliated, because I won't be liked, because I'm going to be rejected. And then just over time, it expands and it expands and it starts with, I won't go to this one place, or I won't go to these kind of places, until it, takes over the entire sphere of anything that's outside of their very small comfort zone, they won't do. And that's when it becomes truly debilitating. I think for a lot of people, probably it is more kind of like a death by a thousand cuts. That all of these things happen, they don't all happen at once. Um, you know, they get more and more anxious, they get more and more fearful. Um, Many of them probably have really experienced rejection and criticism, or they just have an outsized sense of whenever somebody criticizes them, or they think that they've been criticized or humiliated, and so the fearfulness and the avoidance just grows and grows and grows from this small seed until it becomes all encompassing. And then they just can't even leave their apartment or wherever they happen to be residing. Um, and that's when it becomes truly debilitating. And when they, may not even seek intervention, but intervention may come to them because they'll no longer be able to function. And then we're going to be looking at the DSM and say, do they meet these criteria? But a lot of them are going to have other disorders that are going to be diagnosed first. And so it's my experience, this disorder doesn't get diagnosed that often because even though it may be present, there's usually, other things on board that people are more familiar with or that seem more urgent, and that's going to be treated, and this is just going to be kind of treated incidentally. Okay, so now here we come to treatment. So if somebody does have an avoidant personality, um, how do you treat them to get them to stop avoiding everything? Like most personality disorders, you're not going to completely turn this person around into a different person. But if they're debilitated by their avoidance, there are things you can do. In the textbook, they basically just say, it's similar to the treatment for social phobia. There may be some overlap. Professor Orloff's presentation, she mentioned that there are people who think that, avoidant personality disorder and social phobia are basically the same thing. And, that would mean, cognitive therapy, interpersonal therapy, medication for anxiety, maybe antidepressants, which would be appropriate for some maybe, but also, perhaps contraindicated for people who are on like the schizoaffective spectrum or who have other mood disorders. Personally, I reject that hypothesis. I don't believe that they're the same thing. I do think that they have a lot in common. I do think that maybe there are some treatment methods that, work for both or have the potential to work for both. But there's a few, I think, very key differences between avoidant personality disorder and a social phobia. Because at the end of the day, a social phobia is an anxiety disorder, which causes significant distress to the person who experiences it. It's ego dystonic, and many times, like most personality disorders, avoidant personality disorder is not ego dystonic. It can be neutral or ego syntonic. The person who is avoidant does not perceive it as a problem. And another thing that I would say to kind of elaborate on that is that, for someone who just has a social phobia, where they just have this extreme anxiety that's brought up from interacting with other people, or just the thought of interacting with other people, that's, it's that anxiety feedback that is directly inhibiting them. Whereas with somebody who has avoidant personality disorder, in my conception, and my experience of people that I, have seen being considered avoidant by clinicians, it goes deeper than that. It's not just, this negative feedback of anxiety that's preventing them from doing things and causing them to avoid things. It evolves into, almost like a restricted self-concept of, you know, these are things that I don't do because that's who I am. I only do these things, these very few things eventually. Um, like we have the DSM criteria about all these things about this and that and the other thing, makes them feel humiliated or might, and so they avoid it. Um, but in its mature stages, it becomes an identity. Um, and so, that's why it's different from just an anxiety disorder. That's why it's a personality disorder, because it becomes a part of their personality, the restrictions that they place on themselves. They come from a place of fear and anxiety, at least at first, but they incorporate them into their self-concept and then, you know, cease to be outwardly distressing. They become contented with the status quo of their own, avoidance and self-restriction. And that makes it more complicated to treat people like this. Um, that's not to say that these, traditional anxiety disorder interventions won't work. But the person with social phobia might actually go to a psychiatrist to get a prescription or some therapy. People with avoidant personality disorder probably won't most of the time. They show up in treatment because of other things, or because they become so debilitated that they, become institutionalized. Um, and so, a lot of times, for example, if you do have a comorbid psychotic disorder or anxiety disorder on board, you're probably going to have to treat that first. If somebody has a psychotic disorder, administrating antipsychotics that are effective to treat that disorder can help to diminish the avoidance, because you diminish the delusional beliefs that they're trying to defend that have driven them to become so avoidant. They're still going to need coaching and therapy and all kinds of interventions to get out of that avoidant rut, but the overriding influence that caused them to develop the avoidant personality will be suppressed. Same thing like if they have a comorbid anxiety disorder, if you can, give them medication that reduces that anxiety, then you're probably going to have a lot of an easier time going in and using other interventions on the avoidance itself. And then at the end, I say community treatment. Can't miss an opportunity to honk my own horn. I work on a program of assertive community treatment. And, a lot of the people we get are avoidant, because what we do is we go out in the community and we work with people. Because, if you're a traditional therapist or practitioner sitting in your office waiting for your 3 o'clock appointment to show up, if they have avoidant personality disorder, they're never coming. They're just not going to come. You're the number one thing they're trying to avoid. And so, community treatment techniques where practitioners go out into the community and work with people, that's going to be necessary for somebody who is chronically avoidant, especially who has avoidant personality disorder. Go out in the community, knock on their door, take them out by their shirt sleeves if you have to, out into the community and do exposures like you would do with somebody who has an anxiety disorder, except for probably we're also treating some kind of comorbid issue at the same time, right? So you send out the NP or the psychiatrist, you get the appropriate medications on board, and then you send out, somebody, a social worker, a community health worker, a peer, to go work with this person in the community and literally take baby steps and walk them around their own neighborhood and take them into the deli and the diner and show them that it's a safe place now that they've got the right meds on board. And it's a slow process, but it can be effective. Of combined med intervention with drug therapy, and community treatment, and possibly other kinds of therapy on board as well. All right, I know I'm going along, so I'm going to try and be quick on this one. So, cultural implications. Um, cultural standards vary on the acceptable level of shyness and standoffishness and just like avoidance of things. But on the whole, though, for somebody to be diagnosed with avoidant personality disorder, they're having to exhibit some pretty extreme avoidant behavior. So that's, I think unlikely, except in the case which I'll get to in the third point. The DSM says immigrants may be accidentally diagnosed with avoidant personality disorder when really it's just a lack of acculturation. I mean, I guess. I find it hard to imagine the scenario in which that would happen. But sure. I do think that it's important to touch on the fact that there are certain traditions, cultural traditions, in many different parts of the world for people who choose to voluntarily become, like a hermit or like an anchorite or something, like whether it's religiously motivated or not, and that should be obviously taken into account. If somebody is purposefully and meaningfully choosing a solitary lifestyle, whether it be for like a cultural or religious reason, or just otherwise a person of sound mind who's chosen that they want to live alone in a hut in the woods or on the top of the mountain, that's not the same thing as having avoidant personality disorder. That is a conscious choice that may or may not be culturally and religiously supported. Another thing I kind of wanted to go into, because I thought of it, is there's a phenomena in Japan called the hikikomori, where these people who withdraw from society and never leave their apartments, and it's considered like a social ill over there. And this brings up a couple other interesting dimensions to this discussion, because these people are known for a few things. They withdraw from society. They also tend to be extremely online. So another thing to bring into the whole avoidant personality disorder discussion is the idea of, what about internet addicts, which is something that has come up a lot in recent years, that there's people who decide they just want to be on their computer all the time. They don't want to interact with society in another way. They just want to be on their computer. Maybe they have a problem, maybe not. I'm not going to make a judgment on that. I just kind of think it's an interesting thing to consider. And that, it's just an example of, a cultural phenomena of people that isolate themselves. And there may be other examples in other cultures, and things like that should be taken into account. I also think it's interesting to consider if somebody is suffering from something like internet addiction, or maybe just by choice decides they want to live in virtual reality and not be in the real world. Is that something that has anything to do with avoidant personality disorder, or is that a totally different thing? I leave that judgment for another day. I'm not going to spend more time talking about that, but it's something interesting to think about. Okay, so ethical considerations when dealing with individuals who may have avoidant personality disorder. It's going to overlap a little bit with the last one with the culture. Individuals may choose to isolate by choice. That's not necessarily indicative of a personality disorder or any disorder. They may choose to do so for personal reasons, cultural reasons, religious reasons. Make sure to take that into account. Don't intrude on somebody's privacy and isolation just because you find the lifestyle that they've chosen to be one that you don't personally understand. Determine distress and disability. Like we've said, with a lot of personality disorders, people may not be directly experiencing distress. They might not perceive that their avoidance is causing distress, although, it may be causing harm to themselves and others, or making it difficult for them to take care of themselves. Like, there should be a good reason to justify intervention besides just what someone considers to be a bizarre lifestyle or personality. Somebody should be more than just merely eccentric. There should be some kind of harm being caused to someone in order to diagnose a disorder of any kind. Another one I would say is, as a counselor, don't take avoidance of self personally. And this goes in two ways. One, if you're working with somebody who has avoidant personality disorder or who you think does, don't take it personally if they try and avoid you. That's kind of in their nature. You're going to have to work around that and figure out a good way to deal with that. Don't retaliate against them just for avoiding you. After all, that's their personality. The other thing is, if you have a client who's avoiding you, that's not grounds to diagnose them with avoidant personality disorder. Just because a client avoids you, the therapist, doesn't mean they have an avoidant personality. It could just be that they don't like therapy or they don't like you. So don't go throwing around avoidant personality disorder for everybody who skips a session or disappears on you, because that would be unethical.